On the rooftop of Rourke Aerodyne's headquarters in Denver, a helicopter sat fueled and waiting. Elise Rourke paced beside it, phone pressed to her ear, voice tight with panic. Her pilot was in an emergency room. A 9-figure contract was 40 minutes from collapsing. Behind her, a man in a gray janitor's uniform set down his mop. "I can fly it," he said. Her assistant laughed. Elise looked him over, cold and sharp. "Fly this helicopter, and I will marry you." None of them knew they had just mocked one of the finest pilots the Army had ever trained. Nathaniel Marsh was 40 years old, and almost nobody at Rourke Aerodyne knew his name. He worked the overnight shift, mopping the executive floors, wiping down glass, emptying bins nobody watched him fill. He kept his head down and spoke only when spoken to. What they did not know was that Nate had once worn a different uniform. Captain Nathaniel Marsh, United States Army, 2 tours flying medevac helicopters into landing zones other pilots refused. A commendation for valor sat folded in a drawer he had not opened in 3 years, since the night his wife Claire died on an icy stretch of highway outside the city, 8 months pregnant, while he was still overseas. He came home to an empty house and a son born early, fighting for breath in an incubator. He left the Army within the year. He could not sit in a cockpit without hearing Claire's last voicemail, the one where she said she could not wait for him to meet the baby. So he stopped flying. He took a job that asked no questions and let him bring his boy along when the sitter fell through. His son, Caleb, was 6 now, small for his age, with his mother's pale hair and his father's watchfulness. He carried a spiral notebook everywhere, filled with crayon drawings of helicopters with too many rotors and rockets that made no aerodynamic sense. Nate had learned to love those drawings more than almost anything else in his life. Some nights, when the sitter canceled, he brought Caleb to the office, set him up with a juice box in the stairwell, and worked careful, invisible loops around him, until his shift ended. Elise Rourke was 36, and had been running Rourke Aerodyne for 6 years, ever since her father Walter stepped back from daily operations without ever fully letting go. She kept her hair pulled back, her blazers pressed, her voice level even when her hands were not. Years earlier she had been engaged to a man named Preston Voss, charming and ambitious right up until the day she became CEO. He left 3 weeks later, saying he could not spend his life being Mr. Rourke. She had not let anyone close since. She trusted contracts. She trusted numbers. Feelings had cost her once, and she did not intend to pay again. That morning had been arranged with the precision she demanded. A helicopter charter to Halden Systems, a technology firm ready to sign an 8-figure fleet contract, contingent on a face-to-face signing by 10:30. No video calls, no delays. At 8:45, the contracted pilot called from an ambulance. Black ice on the interstate, a fractured wrist. Her assistant, a nervous young man also named Preston, dialed every charter service in the metro area. Nothing available in time. The backup pilot was 3 states away for a funeral. The rooftop went quiet except for wind moving through idle rotor blades. That was when Nate stepped out of the stairwell doorway, mop still in his hand, and said 4 words nobody expected. The assistant laughed first, loud and cutting. Elise turned to look at the man who had said them. Really look. And for a moment, the laughter around her seemed to come from very far away. Nate set the mop against the wall and walked toward the helicopter without hurrying. There was no swagger in it, no performance. He moved the way a man moves when he has done a thing so many times, his body no longer needs permission from his mind. He opened the door, checked the fuel gauge, ran his palm along the tail boom on his way past, tested the rotor lock, glanced at the sky. Small things. Things a civilian would never think to do. Frank Delgado saw all of it. Frank managed the hangar crew, 61 years old, built like a man who had spent 40 years lifting things heavier than himself. He had been standing near the fuel line when Nate walked past, and something in the sequence of movements stopped him cold. He had seen that exact pre-flight rhythm before, decades earlier, taught to him by men who flew into places most pilots would not go. Frank did not say anything. He only watched, jaw tightening, an old word rising in his throat that he did not let out. Captain. Elise did not notice the exchange. She was too busy watching Nate climb into the cockpit, fasten the harness, and place his hands on the controls with a stillness that unsettled her more than any panic would have. The engine caught on the first try. The rotor blades began to turn, slow, then faster, cutting the cold Denver air into a steady thrum that vibrated up through the concrete. For a moment, just before the noise swallowed everything else, Nate closed his eyes. He was not on the rooftop anymore. He was in a hospital hallway 3 years earlier. A nurse walking toward him with a face that told him everything before she said a word. He was holding a phone with a voicemail he had already listened to 11 times. Claire's voice steady and warm, telling him she loved him, telling him to hurry home, telling him she could not wait for him to meet their son. He had been 6,000 miles away when the call came in about the accident. He had not been there. He had spent 3 years believing that if he had been a better husband, a more present one, a man who chose his family over a mission log, she might still be sitting across from him at breakfast instead of in a headstone. He visited twice a year with a boy too young to understand why. He opened his eyes. The instrument panel glowed in front of him, familiar in a way that hurt more than he expected. His hands did not shake. Nate had built a life out of being invisible. Invisible men did not fail anyone, because invisible men were never trusted with anything that mattered. He had chosen the mop and the night shift and the silence on purpose. The same way another man might choose sobriety, one careful decision at a time, because the alternative was letting himself matter to someone again and then losing them. But Caleb needed him to be more than careful. Caleb needed him to be brave in the ordinary ways, the ways that did not come with medals, and some stubborn, buried part of Nate, the part that had once talked a wounded gunner through a full evacuation while taking fire from 2 directions, was still in there, waiting for a reason to come back out. He looked at the controls in front of him now, and felt something shift, quiet and enormous, the way ice shifts on a lake before it finally breaks. Frank watched the helicopter lift smoothly off the pad, no wobble, no hesitation, and allowed himself a single slow breath he had been holding without realizing it. Whatever this cost the man in that cockpit, Frank understood, in a way nobody else on that rooftop could, that it was costing him plenty. The helicopter rose above the skyline smoothly, banking east over the city, with a precision that made Elise grip the edge of her seat, not from fear but from disbelief. Denver spread out below them, the mountains catching the morning light behind. She had flown this route a dozen times with professional pilots, and none of them had made it feel this effortless. "Are you always this steady?" she asked into the headset, half joking, testing him. "I used to do this for a living," Nate said. "Nothing more." "Which airline?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Not an airline," he finally said. She studied the side of his face, the calm set of his jaw, the way his eyes moved constantly between the horizon and the instruments without ever settling too long on either. It was not the focus of someone performing confidence. It was the focus of someone who had learned, a long time ago, that looking away for even a second could cost a life. "Who taught you to fly like this?" she asked. "People who needed me to be good at it," he said, and left it there. She wanted to push further and found, strangely, that she did not want to. There was something about the quiet between his answers that felt more honest than anything her board members had told her in 6 years of running this company. She let the silence sit instead of filling it, which was not something Elise Rourke did easily with anyone. Below them, traffic crawled along the interstate, tiny and slow, the whole ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning moving without them. Elise found herself watching Nate's hands instead of the skyline, the way they rested on the controls without gripping them, adjusting the collective in movements so small she almost missed them each time. "You're not what I thought you were," she said finally. Nate glanced at her. "Just once." "Most people don't think about me at all," he said. It wasn't bitter. It was simply a fact he had made peace with a long time ago. She did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and for the rest of the flight they sat in a silence that felt less like distance and more like the beginning of something neither of them had a name for yet. 14 floors below them, in his home office overlooking the same skyline, Walter Rourke sat in front of a bank of monitors he was not supposed to still have access to. He had built Rourke Aerodyne from a single leased hangar and 2 second-hand aircraft, and even in retirement he kept eyes on every camera the company owned, a habit his daughter did not know about and would not have approved of. He watched the rooftop feed, the helicopter lifting off with a man in a janitor's uniform at the controls, and felt something cold settle behind his ribs. He rewound the footage twice, studying the way the man moved before climbing into the cockpit, the pre-flight checks nobody had asked him to perform. Walter had spent 40 years around pilots. He knew what he was looking at, even if he could not yet say why it worried him more than it should have. He picked up his phone and made a note, the kind of note he had made 1,000 times before about competitors, about board members, about anyone who might one day threaten the thing he had spent his whole life building. This time the note had his daughter's name attached to it, and that was new. Nate set the helicopter down on Halden Systems' private pad, with a landing so soft the coffee cup in the center console did not so much as ripple. He powered down the engine, removed his headset, and sat for a moment with his hands still resting on his knees, as though letting the last 3 years catch up with him before he had to move again. Elise unbuckled slowly, her legs less steady than she wanted to admit. "Thank you," she said. It felt insufficient the moment she said it. Nate only nodded. "Go sign your contract," he said. "I'll be here." She walked into the building on legs that did not quite feel like her own, past a receptionist who had no idea what had just happened 40 feet above her head, into a conference room, where 3 Halden executives stood to shake her hand like it was any other Tuesday. The meeting went exactly as it was supposed to. Elise smiled, negotiated the final clause on service response times, and signed her name at the bottom of a contract worth more than most companies would see in a decade. Her voice did not shake, her hands did not either, not anymore, but her mind was 14 floors up and 40 minutes in the past, on a rooftop, watching a janitor climb into a cockpit like it was the most natural thing in the world. When she stepped back outside an hour later, the helicopter was gone. So was Nate. By the time she returned to headquarters, he was back in his gray uniform, restocking paper towels in a second-floor restroom, as if the morning had never happened at all. That evening, Elise stayed at her desk long after the building had emptied out. She pulled up the company's personnel database and typed his name into the search field. Nathaniel Marsh, hired 8 months ago. Position, custodial staff. No prior employment listed, no references. A background check that came back clean and said almost nothing at all. It was the file of a man who had gone out of his way to leave no trace. She sat back in her chair, tapping a pen against the edge of her desk, the way she did when a number in a spreadsheet refused to add up. There was a version of tonight where she closed the laptop and went home and let this be exactly what it looked like, an unusual morning that would make a good story someday. She knew, even as she considered it, that she was not going to do that. She picked up her phone and scrolled to a contact she had not called in years. A man named Ray Kessler, who had served with a cousin of hers and now worked in military personnel records. She typed out a message asking for a favor before she could talk herself out of it, then sat staring at the screen, waiting, the office silent except for the hum of the building's climate system and the sound of her own heartbeat, which she was annoyed to notice had not quite slowed down since the rooftop. Somewhere below her, in the hangar, Frank Delgado stood beside the helicopter Nate had flown that morning, running a hand along the tailboom the same way Nate had. He had not said a word to anyone about what he suspected. He had made a promise once, a long time ago, in a place far from Denver, and Frank Delgado did not break promises, even when keeping them cost him something. Ray called back a little after 10 that night. Elise picked up on the first ring. "You sitting down?" he asked. "Just tell me, Ray." There was a pause on the line, the kind that told her whatever came next mattered. "Nathaniel Marsh," he said. "Captain, United States Army, helicopter pilot, 2 tours. Commendation for valor after pulling 6 men out of an active landing zone under fire. Honorable discharge. 3 years ago." "Why did he leave?" Elise asked, though some part of her already knew the shape of the answer before Ray said it. "His wife died. Car accident. He had a son born a few weeks later. He walked away from everything after that." Elise closed her eyes. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Ray hesitated. "Yeah," he said. "The guy's a legitimate hero, Elise. Whatever he's doing now, it's not what he's built for." She thanked him and hung up without saying goodbye, and sat alone in her office with the city lights spread out below her, thinking about a man who had once pulled 6 people out of a burning landing zone and was now, tonight, probably somewhere in this same building emptying a trash can nobody would remember to thank him for. She thought about the way he had said, "I used to do this for a living," flat and final, a door closing on a room he had no intention of walking back into. He thought about the way he had looked at the controls before takeoff, not with fear, but with something closer to grief. She had mocked him on that rooftop. She had made a careless joke about marriage to a man who had buried his wife and built an entire second life out of silence to protect his son from ever being hurt the way he had been. The thought sat heavy in her chest for a long time before she finally turned off her desk lamp and went home. 2 nights later, working late again out of habit more than necessity, Elise took the stairwell down toward the parking garage and past the small medical office on the 2nd floor. The door was cracked open. She slowed without meaning to. Inside, Nate sat on the exam table with Caleb curled against his chest, the boy's cheeks flushed with a low fever, his notebook of crayon helicopters clutched in one small fist even in sleep. Nate had one hand pressed gently against his son's forehead, checking the heat of it the way a man checks something he has already lost once and refuses to lose again. He was murmuring something too quiet for her to make out, the same 3 or 4 words repeated in a low, steady rhythm, the kind of sound a father makes, not because the child can hear it, but because saying it out loud keeps his own hands from shaking. He did not call anyone. He did not ask for help. He simply sat there in the fluorescent light, holding his son, handling it the way he seemed to handle everything, alone and without complaint. Elise stood in the hallway, a long moment, unseen, and felt something in her chest crack open, in a way 6 years of boardrooms had never managed to do. She did not go in. She was not sure yet what she would even say. She turned and walked back toward the stairwell instead, carrying the image of him with her the rest of the night, unable to shake the sense that she had just seen something she was never supposed to see and that it had changed how she saw everything else about him. Across town, in a house on Cherry Creek's quiet north side, Walter Rourke sat at his kitchen table with a folder open in front of him and a private investigator's early notes on a man named Nathaniel Marsh spread across the wood. Walter did not yet know the full truth. He knew enough to be certain his daughter was standing closer to a fire than she realized, and he intended to put it out before it spread any further into the company that bore his name. The following week, Rourke Aerodyne hosted a safety review with representatives from a regional charter partner, a routine meeting that would have meant nothing to anyone if not for the man who walked in 15 minutes late, apologizing for traffic on the interstate. His name was Colonel Ed Whitfield, retired, now working as an independent aviation safety consultant. He had gray hair cropped close and the unmistakable bearing of a man who had spent 30 years giving orders. He shook hands around the conference table, and when he reached Nate, who had been called in only to fix a jammed projector cart, Whitfield stopped cold. "Marsh," he said, staring. "Nathaniel Marsh. I'll be damned." The room went quiet. Elise, seated at the head of the table, looked between the 2 men, watching something pass across Nate's face that she had never seen there before, somewhere between panic and resignation. "You flew with the 161st, Whitfield said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Pulled 6 of my men out of a hot zone outside Kandahar under enemy fire. I put you in for the Valor Commendation myself. Last I heard you'd left the service. Nobody could ever find you after that." "Nobody was looking very hard, sir," Nate said quietly, and the room, which had been made of the polite murmur of a routine safety meeting a moment before, went completely silent. Whitfield, to his credit, seemed to understand instantly that he had said too much in front of too many people. He clasped Nate's hand once more, told him it was good to see him alive and well, and let the subject drop. But the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. Every person at that table now knew that the man who fixed the projector cart, the man in the gray uniform who mopped their floors at night, had once pulled 6 soldiers out of gunfire in a helicopter under his own hands. Nate left the room before the meeting ended. Elise found him 20 minutes later on the loading dock behind the building, sitting on an overturned crate, staring at nothing. "I'm sorry," she said, sitting down beside him without asking permission, "for the joke on the rooftop, for not knowing who you were, for a lot of things, honestly." He did not look at her right away. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "You just didn't know." "That's not really an excuse," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, turning something over. "When my co-pilot got hit outside Kandahar, he finally said, I had a choice, land immediately and get him to a field hospital, or push 40 more seconds to a safer extraction point like the mission called for. I chose the mission. He lived. He's in a wheelchair now. I got a medal. He got that. Elise felt something tighten in her chest. That wasn't your fault, she said. I've told myself that 100 times, Nate said. Some days I even believe it. He looked at her then. Really looked. Something raw showing through the calm he usually kept in place. Then Claire died while I was 6,000 miles away doing my job instead of being home with her. And I stopped trusting myself to be the man people needed. So I became a man nobody needed anything from. Nobody gets hurt if I'm invisible. Elise reached over and put her hand over his. Not romantic, not yet, just steady. You flew a helicopter across this city without blinking, she said. You're raising an incredible kid by yourself. You are not the man who disappears when it matters. You never were. Nate looked down at her hand on his, and for the first time since the rooftop, something in his shoulders eased, just slightly, like a weight set down after being carried too long. By Friday, Walter Rourke had heard the story from 3 separate board members, each version more alarming than the last. He called an emergency session of the board for Monday morning, and by the time Elise walked into the room, she understood immediately that this was not going to be a conversation. It was going to be an ambush. Walter sat at the head of the table, a position that technically belonged to Elise now, and had for 6 years, though he had never quite stopped acting like it was still his. He opened with a single sentence. We need to discuss the unauthorized use of company aircraft by an unlicensed member of the janitorial staff. Elise kept her voice level. That unlicensed member of the janitorial staff is a decorated Army pilot who saved an 8-figure contract when we had no other option. That is not the point, Walter said. The point is optics, liability, and judgment. Our insurance carrier would have had grounds to void every policy we hold if that flight had gone wrong. You put this company at risk over a personal impulse. It was not personal, Elise said, though even as she said it, she was aware that was not entirely true anymore. And from the look Walter gave her, he was aware of it too. The meeting stretched into an hour of pointed questions about protocol, about liability, about whether Elise's judgment had been compromised by what one board member delicately called extenuating personal interest. Elise fielded each question without raising her voice, laying out safety data, Nate's verified military flight hours, the insurance carrier's actual written policy, which, it turned out, uncovered emergency substitute pilots, under a clause nobody in the room besides her had bothered to read. What none of them knew, because Walter had been careful to keep it off the agenda, was that he had spent the past 2 weeks in private talks with an overseas investment group interested in acquiring a 40% stake in Rourke Aerodyne. The deal would inject badly needed capital into an aging fleet, but it would also strip Elise of controlling authority over major decisions, quietly returning power to a chairman's seat Walter had never fully vacated. He needed the board rattled. He needed them to doubt his daughter's judgment, just enough to make his solution look reasonable by comparison. After the meeting ended, Nate was waiting in the hallway outside, still in uniform, holding a folder Elise had asked Frank to give him that morning, printouts of flight safety statistics and the insurance carrier's clause she had used to defend the decision. He had spent his lunch break highlighting the relevant sections in yellow marker, his handwriting neat and small in the margins. You didn't have to do this, Elise said, taking the folder from him. I know what it's like to have people question your judgment when you did the right thing under pressure, Nate said. Figured it might help. That evening, Elise confronted her father in his office. The door closed behind her. I know about the investment group, she said. Walter did not deny it. He told her, without apology, that the company needed stability, that she was letting personal feelings cloud decisions that affected hundreds of employees, that he had built this company from nothing, and would not watch her hand it to strangers because of a janitor with a sympathetic backstory. He is not a janitor, Elise said, her voice finally rising. He is a war hero raising a child alone, and I would rather run this company into the ground doing the right thing than keep it afloat doing what you want. You do not get to decide this for me anymore, Dad. Not this, not the company, not anything. Walter's expression did not soften, but something behind his eyes flickered, surprise maybe, at hearing his daughter speak to him like that for the first time in her life. Elise left his office without waiting for a response, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear this time, but from the particular exhaustion of finally saying something she had needed to say for years. Elise found herself in the hangar that night without entirely deciding to go there. She told herself she was checking on the aircraft after the board meeting. She knew, walking through the side door, that this was not really true. Nate and Caleb were sitting on a folding blanket near the tail of the helicopter Nate had flown 2 weeks earlier, a paper bag of sandwiches open between them, a thermos of milk for Caleb, and coffee for Nate. The overhead lights were dim to their evening setting, and the whole hangar smelled faintly of jet fuel and cold concrete, and somehow it looked like the warmest room in the building. Caleb spotted her first. "You're the helicopter lady," he said, delighted, as though she were a character from one of his drawings come to life. "That's me," Elise said, crouching down to his level the way she had seen Nate do 100 times without realizing she had been paying attention. "Do you want a sandwich?" Caleb asked, already pulling one from the bag before she could answer. "It's peanut butter. Dad makes them square because circles waste bread." Elise laughed, a real laugh, the kind she had not let herself have in this building in longer than she could remember. She sat down on the blanket without being asked twice, and for a while the three of them ate in a comfortable, uncomplicated silence, broken only by Caleb narrating the plot of a drawing in his notebook involving a helicopter, a dragon, and what appeared to be his father. "Are you going to marry my dad?" Caleb asked eventually, entirely without warning, the way only a 6-year-old can ask the question every adult in the room has been carefully avoiding. Nate nearly choked on his coffee. "Caleb, buddy," he started. "It's okay," Elise said, though her face had gone warm. "I don't know yet," she told Caleb honestly, "but I like your dad, and I like you too." Caleb seemed to accept this as a perfectly reasonable answer, and went back to his drawing, unbothered, while Nate and Elise sat in a silence that had shifted into something neither of them wanted to name out loud. Not yet. Not with Caleb still awake beside them. Later, after Caleb had fallen asleep against Nate's shoulder, Elise's phone buzzed with a message from a board member she trusted, a warning disguised as a friendly update. Walter had spent the weekend calling members individually, framing Elise's judgment as compromised, suggesting a vote of confidence might be necessary at the next full session. The investment group was pushing for a decision within the month. Elise read the message twice in the dim hangar light, Caleb's small weight still against Nate's chest a few feet away, and felt the shape of the choice in front of her settle into something clear for the first time. She could smooth things over with her father, distance herself from Nate, let the investment deal move forward quietly, and keep the company exactly as safe and exactly as hollow as it had always been. Or she could stand by what she had actually seen with her own eyes, a man who had risked everything for strangers on a rooftop and asked for nothing in return, and risk losing the company her father had spent his life building. She looked over at Nate, who had noticed her expression shift and was watching her with quiet concern, Caleb's notebook still open on his knee, to a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures standing beside a helicopter. "Whatever happens," Elise said quietly, "I'm not backing down from this. Not the company, not you." Nate did not say anything right away. He simply reached over, careful not to wake his son, and laced his fingers through hers, and for once neither of them needed the silence to mean anything more than exactly what it was. Walter's solution arrived 2 weeks later, dressed as an opportunity. He proposed a live flight demonstration for the investment group at the company's private airfield south of Denver, a chance to showcase Rourke Aerodyne's fleet and, not so quietly, a chance to show the board that operations ran fine without Elise's more unconventional decisions steering them. He insisted the flight be piloted by Nate specifically, framing it as a gesture of goodwill toward the man his daughter had defended so fiercely. Elise suspected a trap and could not find its shape in time to stop it. The morning of the demonstration, the airfield hangar filled with investors, board members, and press invited by Walter himself. Nate stood beside the helicopter in a borrowed flight suit, Caleb next to him in a pair of toy aviator sunglasses, grinning up at his father like he had never seen anything more impressive in his life. "You're going to be the best one up there," Caleb said. "You always are." Nate knelt down and straightened his son's sunglasses, his hands steady despite everything sitting heavy in his chest. Frank had run the pre-flight check twice that morning, longer than usual, though he said nothing about why. He had noticed, 3 days earlier, that the maintenance log for this particular aircraft had gaps in it that should not have existed, Service intervals signed off on paper that had not actually happened in the hangar. He had flagged it. Nobody above him had acted on the flag in time. Elise stood near the flight line in a headset, serving as ground support, watching Nate lift off with 3 members of the investment group aboard for a short circuit over the foothills. The helicopter climbed clean and steady, banking west into the morning sun, and for 90 seconds, everything looked exactly the way Walter had wanted it to look. Flawless, controlled, a company with nothing to hide. Then the caution light for hydraulic pressure lit up red on Nate's panel, and the controls went heavy in his hands. He kept his voice level over the radio, the way he had been trained to do a decade earlier, in far worse conditions than this one. Rourke ground. "This is the flight. We have a hydraulic fault, declaring an emergency, returning to the field." Elise's blood went cold. "Copy," she said, forcing the shake out of her voice. "Emergency crews rolling now." In the cabin, one of the investors began to panic, and Nate's voice cut through the headset sharp and calm, the voice of a man who had talked frightened people through worse. "Everyone stays seated, hands where I can see them. We are going to land this aircraft safely. I need you to trust me and stay quiet." The investor stopped talking. Nate fought the controls the last 2 miles back toward the field, feeling every year of training he had tried to bury come rushing back into his hands at once, the calculations, the muscle memory, and the exact angle of approach that would let him bring the aircraft down on a runway instead of into a hillside. Below him, Elise directed the ground crew into position, her voice steady over the radio even as her hand shook against the console, refusing to let herself think about anything except getting him down safely. The landing was rough, a hard bounce and a long skid across the tarmac, but it was a landing, and every person aboard walked away from it. Nate sat in the cockpit for a long moment after the rotors stopped, hands finally trembling now that there was no one left who needed them steady, before Elise wrenched the door open and pulled him out into the daylight, checking him over with hands that would not stop moving across his shoulders, his face, making sure he was real and whole. Frank was the one who found the maintenance record discrepancy in full an hour later, cross-referencing the gaps he had flagged against a budget document that should never have left Walter's private files. Reduced service intervals on 3 aircraft, approved without board knowledge, time to align with the pending investment deal. The corners Walter had cut to make the fleet look leaner on paper had nearly killed his own daughter's future and 3 strangers along with it. The board met again 8 days later, without Walter chairing it. Frank's documentation, paired with the insurance carrier's own investigation, left no room for the story Walter had tried to tell about his daughter's judgment. The reduced maintenance intervals, the timing against the investment deal, the choice to put a deficient aircraft in the air to undermine Elise, all of it came out in careful, damning order. The vote to remove Walter from any remaining operational authority passed without a single dissent. He left the building that afternoon, carrying a box of framed photographs from an office he had occupied for 4 decades, and did not look back on his way out. Elise did not celebrate. She sat in her office that evening with the results still open on her screen, feeling less like a woman who had won something and more like one who had finally stopped losing pieces of herself to keep the peace with her father. It was relief, and something quieter underneath it that felt almost like grief for the relationship they might have had. Nate was offered a permanent position 2 days later, not custodial, not temporary. Director of Flight Safety and Pilot Training, a role built around him instead of one he had to shrink himself to fit into. He accepted it standing in Elise's office rather than a boardroom. No fanfare. Just 2 people who had spent years being careful with everyone else finally being a little less careful with each other. Months passed, ordinary and full at once. Nate rebuilt the training program from the ground up, insisting on standards no one could quietly cut again. Elise ran the company without looking over her shoulder for her father's approval. Caleb started first grade with a backpack covered in helicopter patches Frank had sewn on himself, and brought home a school assignment asking him to write about a hero. He wrote about his dad, the best pilot in the world, and about Elise, who he said had taught his dad how to smile again. On a Saturday evening in late autumn, Elise found Nate on the airfield tarmac, cleaning the same helicopter he had once flown across the city on a dare that was never really a dare at all. The sky over the foothills had turned the color of the inside of a shell, gold sliding into rose, and the runway lights had not yet come on. "I never meant it, that first day," she said, coming to stand beside him. About marrying you, I know, he said, not looking up from the rag in his hands. What if I meant it now? She asked. He set the rag down slowly and turned to face her, searching her expression the way he once scanned an instrument panel, thorough, unhurried. Looking for anything that might not hold, he found nothing but certainty. Nate reached into his jacket and produced a simple silver ring, 2 small wings engraved into the band, the kind of thing a man buys quietly over months, when he is not sure he will ever have the courage to use it. I used to fly for my country, he said. I'd like to fly for you and Caleb now, if you'll let me. Yes, Elise said, before he had even finished the sentence. Caleb, who had been hiding behind a fuel cart with a bouquet of dandelions picked from the edge of the runway, came sprinting out shouting that she was staying forever, and Elise laughed through tears. She did not bother wiping away, lifting him up while Nate slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled them both into his arms at once. They stood there together as the runway lights finally clicked on, gold against the darkening sky. 3 people who had each spent years learning how to be careful, standing very still, very close, in a silence that said everything none of them had needed to say out loud. Neither of them had been looking.